Before soul food meant fried chicken or candied yams, there was the crackle of wood smoke and the sharp scent of wild greens pulled from hard earth. Across fields and kitchens, our grandparents cooked to survive, with ash-baked cornmeal, bitter herbs, and scraps that most would throw away. These 15 lost African-American recipes aren't just forgotten. They were forged through brutality and genius, and kept families alive on rations no wider than a bushel of cornmeal a month. Some of these meals are now unspoken, buried by time and changing taste. Why did they disappear? And what would really happen if you had to eat like your ancestors just to make it through the week? Ashcake was born out of hunger and hard ground, when cornmeal was the difference between making it through the season or not at all. In the fields, with nothing but a handful of meal and a little salt, an unnamed cook would kneel by the embers, scoop up a mix so thick a spoon could stand in it, and shape it right onto a broad leaf. Collard if you had it, oak if you didn't. The whole thing disappeared under a drift of hot ashes, left to bake while the sun pressed down and the overseer's back was turned. Frederick Douglass remembered bread covered with ashes to a depth of a 1/16 of an inch, gritty and hot, but it filled the belly when nothing else would. Some called it ash cake, others hoe cake if a metal blade was handy, but the secret was always in the patience, waiting for that faint toasty smell to rise above the smoke. Wild greens, especially poke salad, were the other lifeline. But pokeweed is a dangerous plant. Every part, from root to berry, is laced with toxins strong enough to kill a grown man. Only the youngest shoots, picked before the stems flushed red, could be eaten. And even then, only after a triple boil in fresh water each time. That wasn't folklore, it was survival science, passed down in whispers. Boil it 3 times, or you'll be sorry. WPA interviews recall elders warning children to stay clear of the berries and roots. But come spring, when stored food ran out, someone always risked it. The greens, once tamed, tasted sharp and earthy, medicine as much as meal. Nothing about these foods was easy or sweet. Ash cake scratched the throat, poke salad carried the memory of danger with every bite. But these were the first field foods, the foundation of a kitchen built on resourcefulness and a little cornmeal. Every meal was a lesson in what could be found, what could be transformed, and what knowledge meant the difference between life and death. A field fire could do more than bake gritty bread. It could coax out small comforts that made the difference between just surviving and feeling human. When the overseer's back was turned, cornmeal wasn't only pressed into ash cakes. Sometimes, a battered hoe blade became a griddle, slicked with a dab of fat if you had it, and a spoonful of meal and water sizzled into a hoe cake. The iron blade gave the bread a browned crust and smoky edge, crisp at the rim and soft in the center. Cornmeal rations were measured out by the pound, meant to stretch a week, so every crumb counted. Still, elders found ways to save a pinch for the children, enough to mix with molasses, the cheapest sweetener on the plantation. Sugar was a luxury, but molasses, thick and dark, cost less and came by the barrel. It dripped onto bread or was boiled down into sticky taffy. On rare afternoons, children gathered for a candy pull, hands buttered to keep the syrup from sticking, laughter rising over the fields as they worked the warm ropes until they turned glossy and gold. But the real medicine came from the pot liquor, the cloudy broth left behind after boiling wild greens or collards. When rations ran thin and meat was scarce, that broth was rich with vitamins and minerals leached from the leaves. Grandmothers would ladle it out by the cup, urging children to drink, calling it strength for tomorrow. Modern science would later find vitamin K, iron, and more in that humble liquid, but the old folks already knew its worth. Pot liquor wasn't wasted. Some sopped it up with crusts of hoe cake, others drank it straight, hot and bracing. It soothed empty bellies, eased sickness, and reminded families that even in lean times, care could be ladled out alongside the meal. These were the small mercies: bread crisped on a field blade, sweetness wrung from molasses, broth saved for the weakest. That turned rations into ritual and survival, into something almost tender. Cornmeal mush began as a way to stretch a handful of meal into something that could last all week. In sharecropper cabins and city kitchens alike, it simmered slow and steady. Just water, salt, and ground corn, poured into a battered pot and stirred until it thickened to the consistency of porridge. When the mush cooled, it set firm enough to slice, ready for frying in a thin slick of lard or leftover bacon grease. Pan-fried, it crisped on the outside and stayed creamy in the center. Humble, filling, and cheap. Some folks ate it plain, others topped it with sorghum syrup or a drizzle of canned milk if they could spare it. Leftovers never went to waste. Slices packed easily for field work or long journeys, where every crumb helped fend off hunger. But when travel meant more than just a walk to the next farm, when heading south or west meant crossing into counties where a black family couldn't count on a safe meal, mothers and grandmothers packed food with a different kind of care. The shoebox lunch became its own ritual. Cold fried chicken, hard-boiled eggs, thick slabs of pound cake, and fruit were tucked into wax paper and nestled inside a cardboard box, sometimes lined with a scrap of cloth. These weren't just snacks, they were protection. On highways mapped by the Green Book, families planned every stop, knowing that a missed turn or an unwelcome look could mean trouble. Restaurants posted whites-only signs, and even gas stations turned travelers away. So, the shoebox lunch was more than food. It was dignity, safety, and a piece of home carried in the back seat. For generations, the matriarch's hands worked before dawn, frying chicken and wrapping sandwiches, making sure no one left hungry or unprepared. Children watched as she packed the shoebox, learning which foods would keep, which would comfort, and how to make do when the world outside offered nothing. Those lunches tasted of salt, grease, and sweet cake, but they also tasted of freedom, the kind you had to plan for, mile by mile, meal by meal. Molasses gingerbread was the kind of treat that made a hard week feel a little softer, especially when sugar was out of reach and the best you could hope for was a sticky, fragrant slice cut from a battered pan. During the Depression and the ration years, molasses was the sweetener that stretched a family's luck. It poured slow and dark from the barrel, filling kitchens with the scent of ginger and clove when mixed into a simple batter. No eggs, no fancy butter, just flour, baking soda, and what you could spare. The result was heavy, a little chewy, and bold with spice, the kind of dessert that stuck to your ribs and your memory. For children, a piece of gingerbread felt like a holiday, even on ordinary days, and the taste of molasses lingered long after the last crumb was gone. Okra soup simmered on many stoves, its roots winding back to West Africa. The word itself, okra, traveled across the Atlantic, showing up in gullah kitchens and city pots alike. In lean times, a handful of okra could thicken a pot of water and scraps into something hearty. Sliced thin, it gave up its silk, turning broth into a stew that could stretch for days. Tomatoes, onions, and whatever bits of meat or greens were on hand joined the okra, creating a dish that was both comfort and proof of heritage. The soup was bright, grassy, and a little slippery, warming bellies and reminding families of the old ways, even as the world outside changed. Then there were chitlins. Boiled, cleaned, and simmered for hours, they were the ultimate test of patience and pride. Once seen as the lowest of the low, slaughterhouse scraps handed down to those with no choice, chitlins became a badge of honor in kitchens across the South. By the Civil Rights era, the chitlin queen presided over holiday feasts, her skill respected, her recipe guarded. Chitlins took over block parties and church suppers, their aroma filling the air, their presence on the table a sign that history could be claimed, not just endured. For many, eating chitlins was an act of remembrance and defiance, a way to honor ancestors who survived on what others threw away, and to turn survival into celebration. Red drink poured from a glass pitcher meant more than quenching thirst. It was a toast to freedom, poured with a steady hand by the oldest woman at the table. The color wasn't just for show. In West African tradition, red meant vitality, power, and the memory of ancestors. Hibiscus, called bissap or sorrel, traveled across the Atlantic in the pockets and memories of enslaved people. Juneteenth tables in Texas brimmed with icy red lemonade, strawberry soda, or homemade hibiscus tea, each sip a link to the old country and a nod to survival. On the same day, a pot of Hoppin' John would bubble nearby, black-eyed peas simmered with rice and a bit of pork if you had it. The peas, round and humble, stood in for coins, a promise of luck and better days. The story goes that after Sherman's march, the peas left behind for livestock became a lifeline for black families. Eating them at the start of the year, or at a celebration, was an act of hope, a wish for fortune. Elders would remind children, don't forget your peas, or you'll miss your luck. So, a glass of red drink and a bowl of Hoppin' John weren't just food and drink. They were rituals, symbols, and a quiet kind of joy, passed from hand to hand, year after year. Smothered pork chops brought the Sunday table to life, a dish that turned plain cuts into something rich and memorable. The secret was in the slow braise. Chops dusted in seasoned flour, browned in hot fat, then buried under a cascade of onions and just enough broth to coax out a silky, golden gravy. That gravy, thickened by time and patience, seeped into every bite, softening the meat until it nearly fell from the bone. On the side, sweet potato pie cooled on the windowsill. The matriarch, never just a cook, but the keeper of family taste, guarded her spice blend like a treasure. Nutmeg, cinnamon, and a whisper of clove, all folded into roasted yams that became sweet potatoes by necessity and tradition. No meal like this ended without cornbread, golden, crusted, and hot from a cast iron skillet. Whether crumbed into pot liquor or saved for breakfast, it was the final word, proof that cornmeal could rise from field fare to celebration when the family gathered close. 1 bushel of cornmeal per month, just 56 pounds, was often all an enslaved family received, according to WPA, slave narratives, and plantation records. Yet from those rations, African American cooks created ashcakes, hoe cakes, and pot liquor, transforming scraps into survival. Documents from the 1930s show how, during Jim Crow and the Great Depression, families stretched what little they had, building travel meals like shoebox chicken and making molasses gingerbread when sugar was rationed. Recipes like chitlins, once a symbol of hardship, became badges of pride and cultural memory, especially during the Civil Rights era. While oral histories and government records reveal much, some recipes remain lost, and not every technique was passed down. Today, many of these survival foods are forgotten outside family circles, but their legacy shapes American cuisine and tells a story of resilience. As photos of battered skillets and handwritten recipe cards fade, the evidence remains. These dishes were more than meals. They were acts of endurance and hope,